Coming up in this episode of the All Aboard Podcast, we talk about Conrail back in the day. Have your tickets out of the envelope. All aboard, please. Now boarding on track number 8 is train number 1. The All Aboard Podcast, your twice weekly excursion into transportation excellence, and I am your conductor, Phil Bell, Enterprise B, PB Crisp, Mr. 645, a highly trained rail enthusiast who may yet one day become a highly trained broadcast specialist. And as always, I am blessed to hold the E. Hunter Harrison Chair here at the Bell Institute for Advanced Railroad Studies, where there are no degrees because the learning never ceases. And for the second time this week, it is great to be back behind this, the Brunswick Green PLB microphone. So we are off to talk about our second installment in Conrail Week. But before we do, I want to alert you to something that is very important in the news related to railroads. The Environmental Protection Agency is looking to rule on a proposal by CARB, the California Air Resources Board, that would restrict locomotives of certain type from being used in the state of California. Specifically, any locomotive that is older than 23 years old would no longer be able to be utilized in the state of California, and there would be more emissions requirements heaped on locomotives overall. Now, I know that many of you out there are listening to this podcast or watching us because you love trains, and this is something that would be devastating to the railroad industry because, as you know, the railroad industry crosses all 50 states, and therefore it must be possible to use whatever locomotives are available to pull whatever trains are available. California has been a problem with this for many years, and this is very much threatening our industry, but it is also threatening all of us as individuals, because if this is allowed to go through and the Environmental Protection Agency agrees to the request by the state of California, then we will very much have a situation where other states will follow suit, and we will have a possibility that certain locomotives, depending on age or otherwise, will be disallowed from this state, here, there, or everywhere, and the cost is going to trickle down to all of us. So what I'm going to do is put a link up on our website, allthingstrains.com, where you can go ahead and send a message to your member of Congress as well as the EPA. Now, we're going to channel those through my employer, which is FreedomWorks, and you can find them at freedomworks.org. That's my day job when I'm not working by talking to you about trains. And they are also doing a project as well on this. I'm not getting paid for it, anything like that. There's nothing nefarious there, but I want to make sure that you know and you are able to take action to help the railroad industry, and that should matter, especially given what we're going to talk about on Conrail here. So let's get to it. Now, Conrail. What is Conrail? Well, of course, Conrail could be seen in a variety of ways. Some people look at Conrail and they say, well, Conrail is a major federal bailout of failing railroads. Other people look at Conrail as being a way of changing the laws associated with the way railroads ran. Others still think of it as being simply a shipping company that painted its locomotives blue. But I would say this. I would say that Conrail is the product of a very unique period in human history, and that is a period where industrial innovation moved at an extraordinarily fast speed. Now think about this for a second. For centuries, horses and buggies in some form, and we might even be in certain cases talking about Roman chariots, were the way that people moved across the land. But as time went on, we quickly had the canals, who were then followed by railroads, and then followed by automobiles, trucks, and airplanes. And so in a very, very short time, really starting in the 1700s and going through the 1960s, we had sharp levels of innovation, or I should say high levels of innovation as far as it goes to transportation. And railroads were very much whipsawed by this. So on one hand, as the spike in innovation slowed, railroads still had services that were important, whether we're talking about passenger or freight services. All of them mattered, but they weren't as necessary as they were in the late 1800s or the early 1900s. And then this change caught so many people off guard. So that's how you had this weird situation where you would have a lot of people who drove their cars to and from work, and of course to wherever they wanted to go, whether it was their vacation or down the street, still going to the government and saying, please don't let the railroad discontinue the passenger trains because we might need it just in case something goes wrong with our cars or things get too congested on the road or otherwise. Same goes with airplanes. And also the same goes with freight service. You had a lot of companies that weren't making use of rail, but certainly would go out and try to prevent abandonments of lightly used rail lines in the instance that they might want to use it later. Now, as a business goes, we know this isn't viable. If someone's not using the business and there's assets that cost money, and railroad lines most certainly do, because we're talking about property taxes, maintenance, insurance, and otherwise that are associated with them, regulatory monitoring, you name it, all of those things go into it. Therefore, the idea that we're just going to keep heavy, high-cost fixed assets around with no use for them whatsoever is very, very difficult, even when times are good. So, this isn't to say, any of it, that railroading is old tech, but as we know, nothing stays new forever, and outside of being part of this unique period of very, very speedy innovation in transportation and otherwise, I do believe that the railroads would have gone partly the way they did, which is building up, getting to be big, and then settling into more of a normality where they would provide an important service as part of a broader transportation network that included trucks and airlines and so on, which to a certain extent is what we have today. But the road to get there was so difficult. And adding to that difficulty is the way that the media perceived the railroads. And you've heard some of these names: Commodore Vanderbilt, Jay Gould, J.P. Morgan. They were all looked at as being evil plutocrats that controlled the railroads and then used them as a cudgel to take money away from the average person, the small business, or otherwise. All of this together is what helped to evolve a very, very stifling regulatory structure that ended up, more than anything else, very much impacting the railroads of the Northeast. And a lot of that is because, first of all, the railroads of the Northeast were some of the oldest that there were, and they were also serving a market that was rapidly changing. The Northeast, of course, for many years was very much America's manufacturing center. But as time went on and we had the growth in labor unions and we had the growth in costs and demands from workers to be paid a lot more, you saw a lot of businesses move out of that area and go into the Southeast, go into Texas, go into California. At the same time, let's also remember, because of the railroads, you had the ability now to move more people and more goods to and from areas that were low cost into more of these areas that were becoming consumer regions. And that very much fits the New York market, Philadelphia, Boston, key areas in the Northeast, where a lot of railroads, which would soon become bankrupt railroads and eventually part of Big Conrail, were serving. So all of this led to a very much evolving and notable railroad problem. Now, the railroad problem had actually been going on a lot longer than we really think of it. So a good example of this was in 1929, Professor William Z. Ripley, as part of some legislation related to the Interstate Commerce Commission, put forth a plan that would have created 21 rail systems by merging a number of railroads together. And when I say a number, I do mean the vast majority of them. And so some of the systems that Ripley proposed, which I think were pretty interesting, for example, the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, which would have included the Jersey Central, the Reading, the Buffalo and Susquehanna, the Buffalo, Rochester, and Pittsburgh, the Detroit, Toledo, and Ironton, the Detroit and Toledo Shoreline, part of the Monon, and the Chicago and Alton. Now, the C&A was partly controlled by the B&O in the first place. The Jersey Central was controlled by the Reading, which was controlled itself by the Baltimore and Ohio. The BR&P eventually did become part of the B&O and is now largely the Buffalo and Pittsburgh, part of the Genesee and Wyoming. The Pennsylvania Railroad was another of the proposed systems, but Ripley there only proposed to put the Pennsylvania, again, one of the largest railroads in the country at that point, together with the Long Island Railroad. Others that he had proposed, the Santa Fe, would have then included not only the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe itself, but the Chicago Great Western, the Kansas City, Mexico, and Orient, which is the second property that was built by Arthur Stilwell, who we will, of course, talk about in a later episode for being one of railroading's great entrepreneurs. The Missouri and North Arkansas, the Midland Valley Railroad, the Minneapolis and Northfield Southern. So this would have created a system that stretched into the upper Midwest, into Minnesota, of course, and then also going out as far as Los Angeles and expanding what would be the Santa Fe's footprint in Texas. And one more, the Missouri Pacific, which included the Texas and Pacific, which it already controlled, the Kansas, Oklahoma, and Gulf, which it also controlled, the Denver and Rio Grande Western, the Denver and Salt Lake, which were eventually put together on their own, the Western Pacific, and the Fort Smith and Western. So that gives you an idea of what Professor Ripley was proposing. And because a lot of those names that I mentioned were considered Class 1 railroads in their day, that gives you an idea, number one, of how big railroading is. But by the fact that we're talking about this in 1929, on the eve of the Great Depression, this was supposed to be what a lot of the railroad press considers to be the golden age of railroading. Yet by that point, the government and railroads themselves recognized there were problems with the industry that were going to have to be solved, and the belief was that consolidation was the way to do it. Now, there was a little bit of consolidation that helped to presage Conrail's creation that came along starting also in 1929, but this from the private sector, and that was the Allegheny Corporation. Now, you know, we've talked about the Allegheny Corporation extensively, especially with Robert R. Young in some of our earlier episodes, but it was the brainchild of Oris P. and Mantis J. Van Swearingen. And now these are some very odd individuals that people don't know very much about. They never married. They were very close to each other. They were brothers, of course, and they were responsible for developing Shaker Heights in Cleveland. Why does this matter? Because they wanted a way to get the people from their great development in the Cleveland area into downtown, so they created Shaker Heights Rapid Transit. That led to them becoming known by the president of the New York Central at the time, who decided we've got to sell the nickel plate to somebody, and he liked these guys, so he sold it to them, and that's what got them involved in Class 1 high-level operations of railroading. And they would end up controlling the Cloverleaf, the Pere Marquette, Lake Erie and Western, which, by the way, is best known as being the original railroad that Nickel Plate 282, number 587, started its career for. The Chesapeake in Ohio, the Chicago and Eastern Illinois, the Denver and Rio Grande Western, the Erie, Missouri Pacific, Texas and Pacific, and the Wheeling and Lake Erie. Now, they ended up, while they were never able to meld this into one large system, although they certainly did try, they did end up coming up with some consolidation as part of this. The Cloverleaf, the Lake Erie and Western, they both ended up being merged into the Nickel Plate, along with the Wheeling and Lake Erie being part of that system as well. Also, the Pere Marquette and the Chesapeake and Ohio would eventually merge, that being under Robert R. Young after he controlled the corporation. The Texas and Pacific was long a vassal of the Missouri Pacific, and it would end up becoming part of that, as would the Chicago and Eastern Illinois later on when the Missouri Pacific was seeking to undo its dual-class stock structure that came about as a result of its bankruptcy, but Allegheny not quite going away. One of the ways they thought they would be able to do that was by merging with the C&EI and adjusting the capital structure of the company. So they ended up working with the Louisville and Nashville to divide the C&EI, and so the majority of it did become part of the Missouri Pacific. A portion of it became part of the L&N, which is now part of CSX's network, and how it ends up getting to Chicago from its main line through Evansville, Indiana. But the C&EI, the Missouri Pacific, the Texas and Pacific, they would all become one railroad, which was the MP, the MOPAC, or the MOP, depending on whether you're a rail fan or a railroader. Railroaders tend to call the Missouri Pacific the MOP, whereas rail fans call it the MOPAC. And I think that all goes back to how it was spelled in Trains magazine. But all those railroads are now a big part of the Union Pacific system. So it does show that some of these early efforts at consolidation did, of course, play out, just not in the way that either Allegheny Corporation or Professor Ripley thought they would. Now, one other thing, since we're mentioning Allegheny and Robert R. Young, and you can tell because we mention him so much on this podcast, he is in fact one of my favorite figures in railroading. But the Young sought to combine the Chesapeake and Ohio, which he controlled through Allegheny after he ended up in control of that company, together with the Kirby family, with the New York Central. And his rationale was that the C&O, which at the time was largely a coal railroad, would be able to benefit from the New York Central's largely merchandise traffic base. The New York Central did have some access to West Virginia coal, but it was nowhere near as robust as the Chesapeake and Ohio's. And likewise, the C&O did have some manufacturing, and it ended up gaining more after it took over the Père Marquette. And the Père Marquette, of course, being a very substantial railroad serving the Detroit manufacturing area with the burgeoning auto industry, as well as other manufacturing that took place there, and then also going into Chicago itself, being a manufacturing center. But he said, look, putting these two together will work very well. The New York Central management fought him tooth and nail on it. The Interstate Commerce Commission, also being somewhat part of railroad world, was not exactly enamored of Young, never really was, and they would not let him pull that merger off. But as we know from our previous discussion of Conrail in episode 34, a large portion of the New York Central was eventually joined with the Chesapeake and Ohio through the 1999 division of Conrail between CSX and Norfolk Southern. Now you have the eastern portion of the New York Central, which is that famous water level route main line out of the North Jersey area on the West Shore side, going up to Albany and then across through Syracuse, Rochester, Buffalo into Cleveland, then being tied in with the Baltimore and Ohio that gets them to Chicago, but also being tied in through Deschler, Ohio, and some of those central Ohio localities to the C&O, which serves Toledo, and then, of course, goes down into the coal fields of West Virginia and out to Virginia, where it meets the port of Norfolk, which is Port of Virginia area. And that means that a lot of that traffic, which, of course, in the past was coal, but in the future may, but I say not for sure, but may include intermodal traffic if it ever does end up on the Newport News side operating, being fed into the New York Central and a lot of that network that was built up in the 1960s. Now, that we understand a lot of what was thought about and how consolidation was believed to be a savior of the railroads, let's talk about some of the railroads that became components of Conrail. And the first, the biggest, and the best known, of course, is the Penn Central, better known as the Pennsylvania New York Central Transportation Company, at least its original way. The Penn Central was formed on March 1st, 1968, when the Pennsylvania Railroad and the New York Central merged together to form a 20,000 route mile system that actually had close to 40,000 track miles. And so let me dramatize that for you with this map. For those of you who are watching on CP5 Cam, this is what the original Penn Central system looked like after it was created. And this map was from actually a website called Map Porn. So yes, for everybody that likes to make those jokes, Map Porn is where I found this. But what you see here is you have the extensive New York Central system that radiates out of the New York City area, includes the former Boston and Albany through Massachusetts, and then you're going up through what's thought of as the upper tier of New York, including a stretch that crosses southern Ontario, and that is the Canada Southern, as well as the famous Lakeshore and Michigan Southern Main Line along the southern edge of Lake Erie, which gets you across northern Ohio, northern Indiana, and into Chicago. And then you have the Big Four line that goes south out of Cleveland and then down to Indianapolis and eventually St. Louis. The Pennsylvania, of course, you see it goes south out of New York and has extensive lines that radiate out of the Philadelphia and Wilmington area. And of course, that's because it is the Pennsylvania Railroad, where it was the strongest. A very strong network in central Pennsylvania. A lot of that traffic was heavy coal traffic. And a substantial portion of that network, by the way, still does continue to exist, being operated by railroads like Norfolk Southern and also the Nittany and Bald Eagle system. This has continued to be strong traffic generator for the railroads. And then this coal area not only brought coal east, it also brought coal and other minerals such as iron ore up to Lake Erie. So you see a lot of the network, both former Pennsylvania and New York Central lines, going up to Lake Erie, where it went to a variety of places through the Great Lakes. And then, of course, looking at Ohio and Indiana, you can see both of those states were blanketed by the Penn Central's trackage, both former Pennsylvania and New York Central. The one thing that is not shown here is the New York, New Haven, and Hartford, which was included in Penn Central at the beginning of 1969. And as you've probably heard, it was very much a big drag on the Penn Central, which itself was already created out of two railroads that in many cases could be considered functionally bankrupt. One fact that I did receive in the preparation for this that came from the Men Who Love Trains, which we will be reviewing tomorrow, that is Thursday, April 4th, is that the Pennsylvania itself required about $150 million in the bank on a daily basis in order to operate. When the Pennsylvania and the New York Central merged on February 1st, 1968, they had a combined $13 million in the bank. So that tells you that both of those companies were in trouble from the start, and then adding the assets, although not the corporate structure, of the long bankrupt New York, New Haven, and Hartford to it at the beginning of 1969 certainly didn't help matters, and that's before there's any discussion of the ins and outs of how that merger took place, how things were done poorly, and so on. What I will refer you to before we are able to get to it on this podcast, and we certainly will, is Merging Lines by Richard Saunders Jr. We did review that, and we'll include the review in the link in the description here. Also, The Men Who Love Trains, which we will review as well as The Wreck of the Penn Central, which is a great in-depth discussion and does include some speeches or discussion from Stuart Saunders, who was the head of the Penn Central that led the company into the merger, but also into bankruptcy, and then No Way to Run a Railroad, which looks at it from the perspective of David Bevan, who was the CFO, Chief Financial Officer, of the Pennsylvania and Penn Central, and is largely either credited, depending on what time you're looking at, or reviled for what he did. On one hand, he did keep the company afloat, but others believe that a lot of his financial machinations ultimately led to the Penn Central's collapse. Now, one of the railroads that the Penn Central owned that was also a financial loser, that is, however, beloved by us as rail enthusiasts and was certainly critical to the operation and movement of freight in the Northeast region, was the Lehigh Valley. Now, the Lehigh Valley was 1,254 route miles and ran from Newark, New Jersey to Buffalo. And let's see if we can't get you a little picture of what the Lehigh Valley looked like toward the end. There you go. So the Lehigh Valley, which again you can see roughly the New Jersey western shore of the Hudson River or west bank of the Hudson River, going on up to Buffalo via Ithaca, where the famous Cornell red paint comes from. The Lehigh Valley was 97.8% owned by the Pennsylvania and the Penn Central. So the story, 97.3. Let's make sure that we get it right. They shared a treasurer and treasury functions, but it was managed independently of the Pennsylvania Railroad. Why the Pennsylvania took this company over or decided to purchase it, there really isn't a good explanation, considering that it was a loser financially, but a lot of the belief centers around the fact that it did have a very good route between the North Jersey port area and Buffalo, and that filled something of a hole in the Pennsylvania system. You see, if the Pennsylvania wanted to move traffic out of North Jersey and get it up to the Buffalo area, what it would have to do is take it south to Philadelphia and then west across the famous Middle Division Main through Harrisburg, and then, or the eastern end of what is the Middle Division Main toward Harrisburg, and then go north up the Buffalo line, which was and is a long and circuitous route that goes through central Pennsylvania and then eventually gets you into Buffalo. Now, a portion of this route is now part of the Western New York and Pennsylvania, which is a short line / regional carrier, a little bit more of a regional than a short line, that operates both this portion of the Buffalo line as well as a portion of the former Erie-Lackawanna main line between Hornell and I do believe Corey, Pennsylvania. The remainder of the Buffalo line continues to be used by Norfolk Southern, which is how it gets from Enola Yard in the Harrisburg area up to Sunbury, Pennsylvania, where it accesses the D&H South, which is the portion of the former Delaware and Hudson that it purchased from Canadian Pacific back in 2015. So while the Buffalo line was not a great line, it did continue to play an important role. It just wasn't ideal for the movement of traffic between the New York area and Buffalo. That was the Lehigh Valley's job. And the Lehigh Valley did it fairly well. But again, this was a railroad that was operating in a declining region of the country, at least as far as manufacturing and heavy industry is concerned, but a growing consumer market. What would the Lehigh Valley be today? We're not sure, but portions of it continue to be operated, most notably the Lehigh line of Norfolk Southern, because this is now how Norfolk Southern and then previously Conrail was able to access the Pennsylvania main without getting on the Northeast Corridor. So that is the Lehigh Valley. Now, one more thing about it. Part of the way it was propped up was by the Penn Central not collecting interline balances that were owed by the Lehigh Valley. So that helped to keep it not solvent, because it certainly wasn't solvent, but less of a problem. And then in 1970, a month after Penn Central, who itself declared bankruptcy in June, July comes along and the Lehigh Valley falls as well. The next railroad that is part of Conrail, a component, or I should say Big Conrail, is none other than my favorite, the Erie-Lackawanna. And since we are a railroad podcast, we got to make sure to show you a map for those of you on CP5 Cam. Right there you see the map of the Erie-Lackawanna. So you have also from the western shore of the New York City area, there, in their case, Hoboken and Secaucus, New Jersey, going up to Buffalo, with branches that go to Oswego via Syracuse, as well as Utica, New York. Then you have, of course, routes that go to Buffalo, former Erie, and Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western. You have two routes out of the New Jersey area, one that goes through Scranton. And, oh, by the way, the rail yard that is behind the mall at Steamtown, for those of you who are watchers of The Office, that was the Erie-Lackawanna City Yard. Now, in The Office, they don't actually go to the mall at Steamtown, and they don't actually go to the yard, which is used by Steamtown now, and also the Delaware-Lackawanna Railroad. They do not go to it in The Office, at least not that I've seen, but it is alluded to, and they're actually in California, of course, where they did some of this filming. So there is another way that the Erie-Lackawanna, in a way, seeps into pop culture. You see then, of course, the carrier, once you get out of the New York State, comes down through western Pennsylvania, through Meadville, which is where it had its major car shops, into the Youngstown area, where the majority of its traffic was generated, because it was very much a steel and steel components hauling railroad. A branch to Cleveland, where its headquarters were located, a branch to Dayton, Ohio, and then, of course, the western stem, which went to Chicago, Illinois. One thing you might note is you'll see on a lot of their maps, they do show them going to both Indianapolis and Cincinnati. Well, they did, but they only went on haulage rights, not trackage rights, and not directly. Now, there was a time when the Erie did control a route that the Cincinnati, Hamilton, and Dayton, it had merged with it briefly, and this is during the J.P. Morgan era, but from what I understand, the CH&D was financially a struggle, so the Erie, in a moment of absolute insanity, decided they were going to give up the CH&D, and so, of course, that ended up becoming part of, I believe, the Baltimore and Ohio, and being very successful there as well. And again, because it's a railroad podcast, if I don't show you E8s, and this is an Erie-Lackawanna E8 number 813, originally built for the Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western, I would not be doing my job. So there you go. Now, the next component that we will talk about as part of Big Conrail was the Lehigh and Hudson River. Now, the Lehigh and Hudson River is often forgotten. In fact, I even almost forgot about it in the last episode. It was only 73 route miles long, and it had an additional 35 miles that it operated via trackage rights. And it went roughly from Maybrook, New York to Easton, Pennsylvania. And what I want to do is really show you a map here, because it's interesting to think about what the Lehigh and Hudson River was and what the Lehigh and Hudson River very much could have become, because this carrier avoided going through the New York City area. And you might say, well, wait, why would you want to avoid going through the New York City area? Well, every major metropolitan area, while they are certainly big traffic generators and have a lot of positive things to offer, they have the negative of being a place that is quite slow to get through. So the Lehigh and Hudson River going through western New Jersey created the ability to avoid going through the middle of the North Jersey port area, which is where Conrail has its major operations today. And so here we go. and there's your map of the Lehigh and Hudson River. So you see going through the western part of New Jersey and then up to Maybrook. And Maybrook Yard was an important point in the rail system because that's where the New Haven came over from the east side of the Hudson River. And this was the only railroad crossing that was located between New York City and Albany. So it was important for freight that was not able to go through the Pennsylvania Railroad's tunnel, and very little freight was moved through the Pennsylvania Railroad's tunnel from North Jersey into New York City. There's a story about the Pennsylvania really trying this in the late 1960s just to prove that it was possible. And what they ended up doing was breaking a lot of knuckles and really having a mess on their hands. And most certainly today in time, while Conrail, CSX, and Norfolk Southern technically can go through the tunnel, they most certainly would not be welcome to do so by Amtrak, who is now the owner of the Northeast Corridor line. So the New Haven was able to move traffic into Maybrook, and from Maybrook, it was able to go down the Lehigh and Hudson River to get into Pennsylvania, where it could reach the Lehigh Valley in the Allentown area, as well as other carriers, the Jersey Central and so on, that were able to get into that region as well. It had the possibility of being an outlet for the New Haven, and the New Haven did at one point in the J.P. Morgan, Charles Mellon days try to take it over, but it was ultimately unsuccessful in doing so. The L&H is probably best known for its Alco fleet of diesel locomotives, and that it's sadly mostly now gone, but fair amounts of it do still exist, and portions continue to be operated most notably by the New York Susquehanna and Western and Middletown in New Jersey, as that is how the NYS&W now gets from the Sparta Junction area in northwestern New Jersey and Sussex County up to the former Erie-Lackawanna-Graham line near Maybrook in Campbell Hall. I'm sorry, I almost forgot about that. How could I ever forget Campbell Hall? But Hamptonburg Township, Campbell Hall, New York. Now, the next is the Reading, and the Reading is a very famous railroad. It was a satellite for a long time of the Baltimore and Ohio, and it was very much an anthracite road. And here we've got a picture I took a few years ago of one of the observation cars from Reading's famous Jersey City to Philadelphia Crusader train that ran for many years and then continued to run under NJDOT and Conrail after the Reading was swept into Big Blue. But the Reading also had two problems. Number one, it was very much tied to coal operations, and as coal started to decline, its fortune started to decline as well. It was also a relatively short carrier, with most of its operations being located in Pennsylvania between Philadelphia and Harrisburg, but also having extensions that got it into the New York City area and connecting it to the carrier it controlled, the Jersey Central. The Jersey Central being the next carrier. And by the way, before I forget, the Reading also went into Delaware, and that's notable. We always tend to forget that. And the other thing that is interesting for the Reading, although it was controlled by the Baltimore and Ohio, it was part of the Alphabet route, which included the Western Maryland and the Jersey Central. And that gave the N&W access to the New York City market. So that shows you that while you had a lot of very interesting alliances of railroads, either through direct stock control or some form of indirect influence and very close informal agreements to move traffic, that a lot of these alliances could cut many ways. So sometimes a satellite of a competitor was actually what would give you your access to get where you were going. And that's what makes railroading all the more interesting as you delve into a lot of the arrangements that existed in the 1960s and earlier. Now, the other that we wanted to mention here, of course, as I said, is the Jersey Central. And the Jersey Central was a very, very interesting carrier as well, in that it had a extensive network in New Jersey. It had an extensive network that went down to South Jersey, where it served a lot of sand traffic that really helped to prop up the carrier for many years. It also had a pretty extensive anthracite network that, of course, as we mentioned, declined pretty precipitously as the 20th century wore on, and this put it in very much a problem. Now, it continued to be controlled by the Reading and then therefore by the Baltimore and Ohio, so it was the Baltimore and Ohio's outlet into the New York City area. But the one thing that it had that absolutely killed it, besides from the short hauls, were the commuter trains, and it was a very extensive commuter service. So after the carrier went bankrupt, you had the state of New Jersey start to subsidize the carrier's commuter services and the carrier overall, and then eventually you saw these services later become part of Conrail and New Jersey Transit, some of which are still operated today. And I have been told stories about an individual named Gordon Fuller who once worked for the Jersey Central and may or may not have had his hand in the cookie jar. And I'm just teasing that so you know in the future we will be doing some crime and punishment stories, railroad style, here on the All Aboard podcast, and Gordon Fuller is one of the first that we will tackle. Now, another carrier that became part of Conrail, Big Conrail, was the Pennsylvania Reading Seashore Lines. And the Pennsylvania Reading Seashore Lines, and we're going to show you a picture here that I took back in 2021. This is actually Cape May Seashore Lines, but you'll see the locomotive on the right, number 2661, is a GP38-2, a GP38. Number 2661 is a locomotive that was built for the Pennsylvania Reading Seashore Lines. You see it at right, and it actually has an extended cab. So for those of you who are pickup truck fans, yes, we have extended cabs in railroading, but he had an extended cab here that actually bumped the cab out, and this is what allowed it to have dual control stands in the cab so that you could operate the locomotive easily either from the engineer's side or the fireman's side, and so it could operate long and forward. The Pennsylvania Reading Seashore Lines, however, is an interesting carrier because it is the product of consolidation that also started fairly early. In 1931, the New Jersey Board of Public Utilities mandated that the Pennsylvania and the Reading, who had been very stiff competitors serving the South Jersey rail market, combine their networks. And this is how the Pennsylvania Reading Seashore Lines was born in 1933. The PRSL is notable because it was not actually a bankrupt railroad, but it was controlled by two bankrupt railroads and quite frankly didn't have a lot of prospects on its own. Now, as time goes on, we would see that carriers like the Cape May Seashore Lines, which operates a substantial portion of the trackage under lease from the state of New Jersey, or specifically New Jersey Transit, as well as the Southern Railroad of New Jersey and the Winchester and Western, would end up operating parts of this network successfully. Of course, they did so in the post-Conrail era, in a deregulated era, and in very much a time that was substantially different from the business conditions that the PRSL itself was running in. And one more railroad that we have to include, because I found a good picture of it that included that is totally unprototypical for the New York and Long Branch, but we're going to show you anyway. And here you go. This is New Jersey Transit E8, number 4253. Why are we talking about this? Because it has a New York and Long Branch logo, which I don't believe was ever actually prototypical, but a few of the New Jersey Transit, New Jersey DOT E8 units that were operated by Conrail and later by New Jersey Transit did have this logo put there. But the New York and Long Branch, just like the Pennsylvania Reading Seashore Lines, was a combination of interests of two railroads that were operating in New Jersey. And this railroad is roughly now what New Jersey Transit's North Jersey coastline is. Now, of course, it had freight service on it as well, and this goes to the upper portions of the Jersey Shore, branching off at Rahway, but it is a combination of the Pennsylvania and the Jersey Central's interests in that area, and they operated it together. Now, what's different about it from the PRSL is that it didn't have its own locomotives, at least not that I've ever been able to find much of a record of, and so therefore, most of what you see are Pennsylvania or Jersey Central trains that were, or appear to be, Pennsylvania and Jersey Central trains operating over the route, even though it was technically part of the New York and Long Branch. And on April Fool's Day 1976, it, along with the others, was swept into Conrail. Now, the list of railroads that actually became part of Conrail is fairly long, and we're not going to get into all of them because a lot of them were terminal railroads or smaller carriers like the Buffalo Creek, which, while noteworthy on their own, in some cases were actually being operated as part of larger railroads and otherwise. But what I want to cover here, first of all, is the 3R Act, the Regional Rail Reorganization Act of 1973. This is very much a product of the Penn Central collapse. And the Penn Central collapse is a very in-depth discussion because keep in mind, this was the biggest bankruptcy in American history, and it would stay that way until Enron in the early 2000s. So that shows you how critical it was what happened to the Penn Central. But the thing is, no matter how much discussion had gone on about the railroad problem or the various problems with railroads, Congress and the bureaucracy were very unwilling to listen to what the railroads had to say. And this is how we ended up with so much trouble in the Northeast in particular, and why the Penn Central was ultimately collapsing just less than 2 full years after it was created. And to give you an idea, when the report came out by the Securities and Exchange Commission and other government entities about what happened with Penn Central, some of the recommendations actually proposed to strengthen and make rail regulation even more difficult and make it more difficult for the railroads to operate and issue securities as opposed to less. And so this is in a very short time between 1973 and then 1980, when the railroads were largely economically deregulated by the same Representative Harley Staggers of West Virginia, who at one point proposed to make things even more difficult in the wake of the Penn Central collapse. One of the seminal moments was when Jonathan O'Haron, who had become the Penn Central CFO following David Bevan's dismissal, spoke to Congress and just simply laid his cards on the table. He told them that their regulatory structure, which absolutely didn't work, was largely responsible for it. And the members of Congress, or in this case specifically the U.S. Senate, their response was simply to grumble and attack him. But over time, they did see this because Penn Central, when it operated in the pre-Conrail times after the bankruptcy filing took place, there was no guarantee that it was going to be able to continue to operate like any other Chapter 11, or in this case, Section 77 bankruptcy debtor, where operations continue on while the debt holders and management and potentially equity holders, who are usually wiped out, get together with the judge and figure out what they're going to do. There were times where it was believed the entire Penn Central would be shut down because there was not sufficient funds to do it. The 3R Act helped to get more money to operate the Penn Central and other carriers that were operating in bankruptcy, such as the Erie-Lackawanna and the Lehigh Valley. Now, this led to the creation of the preliminary system plan, and that is something that was covered extensively by Jim Hagan in a Railroaders Hall of Fame video that we're also linking with this. That is basically when you had a bunch of people, including Hagan, who is, of course, one of Railroad's most celebrated CEOs, get together and say, well, this line is viable, that line is not viable. I'm not sure how accurate they were about what they did, but as Mr. Hagan said, he basically had to tell a lot of people, if you're not going to use the railroad, you're not going to have the railroad anymore. And that was a type of ruthless cutting and determination that was employed by the United States Railway Association, the second USRA, which was created to structure and provide funds to Conrail. And then on April 1st, 1976, Conrail did begin operations. Yes, on April Fool's Day. And it was led by Edward Jordan, who was a insurance executive from California. And so that gives you an idea of how different things did become on April 1st, 1976. It's important to note, as Conrail does talk about in their employee magazine at the time, that Conrail was not merely a continuation of the former railroads. It was something that was completely new. And while there were a lot of executives that did come over from some of the previous carriers, this was a completely new operation, and not even all of the properties that were owned by those carriers went with it. And I'm not just speaking in this instance of rail lines. I'm speaking of properties that were associated and otherwise. So if you ever go to the Pennsylvania Railroad Technical and Historical Society's chronology of what happened in the past, you will note that certain properties were in fact not included. And so that meant the successors, Conrail and Amtrak, had to find new ways to do a lot of things. And so this shows you the era that started with what would later become Big Blue, because blue was actually also not its original color, it was supposed to be brown by some accounts, would be dramatically different. Now, the next major thing that happened came in 1977, and that was when the MBTA, the Massachusetts Bay Transportation Authority, which by then was subsidizing the commuter services of Conrail as well as the Boston and Maine, decided to pick the Boston and Maine to operate these trains, which had formerly been operated by Conrail. So that led to NRSA, the Northeast Rail Service Act, which saw in 1983 all commuter operations that were provided by Conrail be passed on to local entities. The former Erie-Lackawanna train they were operating out in Ohio ended in, I believe, 1979. 1978. And then you also had the creation of New Jersey Transit, Metro North, and so on. And this is what finally got Conrail out of the passenger business for the rest of its existence. After NRSA, Conrail continued to operate, and of course the Staggers Act in 1980, which is what deregulated the industry, largely in response to Congress now having to pay the bills for Conrail and see how difficult it was to operate a railroad under a system where there was almost no freedom of the railroads to be market actors. So Conrail is very much important to the entire industry because this is what it brought about. Then, March 27th, 1987, Conrail was privatized. And this was privatized in what was, for many years, the largest initial public offering in the history of the United States. And that came after a very long and bruising battle, because by the time Conrail had become profitable, then under President L. Stanley Crane, who had come from the Southern Railway, it was believed that, well, they'd have to do something. Elizabeth Dole, who was transportation secretary under President Reagan, one of the transportation secretaries under President Reagan, proposed to sell the entire company to Norfolk Southern, who by that point, this is the merger of the Norfolk and Western and the Southern Railway, believed that they wanted to take over Conrail now because, as I mentioned in the previous episode, a lot of the distressed assets were no longer distressed. They no longer had the obligation to operate commuter trains. They no longer had the massive debts that went along with companies like the Pennsylvania, the New York Central, the Erie-Lackawanna, and so on. A lot of that had gone away. A lot of duplicate infrastructure had been removed. And Norfolk Southern said, well, look, now it operates really well. We would love to go back into the Northeast rail market, seeing as they had at one point put what was termed by some to be a firewall at roughly Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and saying, we never want to go, in this case the N&W, never want to go east of there. Now they wanted back in. But, of course, that led to a hue and a cry from a variety, including CSX, who threatened to stop operating the Baltimore and Ohio and totally retrench from the Northeast and Midwestern region, because this would have given Norfolk Southern absolute dominance over rail transportation in the East. So what ended up happening after quite a bit of fight, where the famous phrase, let Conrail be Conrail, came from L. Stanley Crane. Conrail was privatized, and then it would operate for the next 9 years as a publicly traded company on the New York Stock Exchange. And then, of course, we get to October 15th, 1996, where the big takeover battle began. And then May 31st, 1999, when Big Conrail passed from the railroad stage. And then, of course, as you saw in the previous episode, it continues to exist operating shared assets. Now, a little bit of what I guess I could call potpourri. One of the things I loved about Conrail the most, the train symbols. They were 4 characters for most of the road trains. So it showed you the beginning and the end. OISE, Oak Island Yard in Newark, New Jersey. SE, Selkirk Yard near Albany, New York. Easy to understand. ALBU, Allentown Yard, Allentown, Pennsylvania. BU, Buffalo. Now, that was pretty easy, but it was possible on a railroad like Conrail because although they had a lot of traffic, they didn't have as many endpoint cities as, say, a CSX or Norfolk Southern. And that is also why once Norfolk Southern and CSX took over their portions of Conrail that you saw a lot of these changes in symbols, and you didn't see the Conrail approach be included in either of those carriers, although at least on CSX's case, you did see those Conrail symbols continue to exist for a while. Another portion of Conrail that everybody really loves, it's right here, the office car special. We all love the office car special, and there is Conrail number 2, the first Conrail number 2, I believe, that is painted in blue, which was the first scheme the office car special had. Eventually, Stanley Crane, when he was CEO, would change that from blue to the famous Pullman green. And again, as this is a railroad podcast, and as your highly trained rail enthusiast who loves E8s and the Erie Lackawanna, you know we had to show you Conrail number 4022, which was Erie Lackawanna 833. And that, of course, is wearing the famous Pullman green with gold lettering, which was not dark green locomotive enamel, as some had suggested, the DGLE being the Pennsylvania Railroad's famous Pullman green, dark Brunswick green color, and of course the Brunswick green PLB microphone. But this is the office car special as it looked in its latter years, and it most certainly was probably the most recognizable part of Conrail. And I do have a little bit of a story with that. I believe it was 1995. Went on a trip to that area in Reading and Lancaster and so forth with my aunt and my grandmother, and I wanted to see the office car special. But of course, you can't expect to see the office car special. It pretty much goes where it needs to go, when it needs to go there. And in the pre-internet era, we didn't exactly have the train tracking tools and the internet websites and so forth that we use to track now. But we went over by Enola Yard anyway, and sure enough, not only was the OCS there, but the OCS was there with the 4022, which was, of course, is still my favorite locomotive. And so I was able to get a shot of it. And I remember the crew was nice enough to uncouple the GP10 that was a switcher so I could get a great shot of the nose of the locomotive. And of course, when the house got sold, the photo went with it. So I don't think I'm ever going to be able to recover it, but it exists in my mind's eye and always will. And one more interesting Conrail tidbit here that they were very well known for was the orange juice train. And so here is a shot of what Conrail had symboled as OJT passing through Metuchen, New Jersey. This was originally run in conjunction with the Seaboard Coastline, later the Seaboard System, and of course CSX. Later, CSX now moves the traffic as part of intermodal trains IO31 and IO32, comes up from Bradenton, Florida, and goes to Kearney, New Jersey. This was also, of course, the subject of a case in the Harvard Business Review as an example of how the railroads were a critical part of transportation infrastructure. So this is Conrail of yesterday. And before I let you go, one more thing, as you might note, if you look at our thumbnail and anything associated with this, you see it is capital C, lowercase o, lowercase n, capital R, lowercase a, lowercase I, lowercase l. That is how Conrail was originally spelled and the way the word mark was done when the company was first created. Although, of course, that was quickly superseded by the Conrail in all capital letters that was used on the locomotives, both in the pre-quality era and in the Conrail quality era. Just wanted to note that. And also, one last thing here, the thumbnail, you'll see SD40-2, C40-8W coming up the River Line with a freight train. This was one that I took in the mid-1990s at Ridgefield Park at CP5, which was, of course, one of my favorite places to go Railfan. Great Railfan community that developed there. Some of us are still friends to this day. And we had a great time seeing the operation of truly a special railroad. And what was so neat about that is just the eclectic mix of locomotives and the freight that Conrail would move, and the fact that it was such a very well-run, highly regimented operation, especially toward the end. So again, it is something we're always going to love. We're always going to miss it. Thank you to Conrail for all that you have done. Now, Thursday, we will be back with a review of The Men Who Love Trains, which talks about how Conrail became created, along with a few other things from the standpoint of Jim McClellan, who played a key role in both Conrail and Amtrak's creation. And then on Friday, I will have a piece coming out in my From the E. Hunter Harrison Chair series that also talks about Big Blue. So I hope you're enjoying Conrail Week. Please share your memories in the descriptions. We'll see you down the main line, and I hope you have a great day.